Hey Growing Zone kids, it's Pastor Jason, and do you know what this is? This is a magnifying glass, and do you know what it does? Well, by looking through it, it helps us to see things. In fact, it helps us to see things that we might not see if we're not looking close enough. So this is really helpful when you want to look at things that you might otherwise miss. Well, we'll get back to it in a second, but I have a question for you. Have you ever wondered why God does some of the things that He does? Have you ever been reading the Bible and wonder why God does things? Well, today, Pastor Mike is going to be talking about the plagues that happened in Egypt. You might remember this, but remember when God's people, Israel, were in Egypt, they were in slavery, and God promised them that He would take them from slavery out of Egypt and bring them up into the land of Israel, the promised land, where they would be their own nation. And God promised them, I'll be your God, and you will be my people. But of course, the problem is right now is that they were stuck in Egypt, in slavery, and Pharaoh would not let them go. He was the king of Egypt, and he was the boss, and he would not let God's people leave. And so God decided He was going to send some plagues, some really horrible things that happened to Egypt. And this was to show Pharaoh that God was God. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, if you've ever asked the question of why God does the things that He does, let me answer that for you. He does it to show His glory. He does it to show Himself so that we would know Him. He does it so that we would know that He's the creator of everyone and everything, and that He is in control of everything. We call this God's sovereignty. And He does this to show us that we should worship Him alone. Now, what is His glory? It's everything that makes God God. It's His power, it's His wisdom, it's His love, it's His justice. It's these things that God has to the biggest amount. That's what God's glory is. It's everything that makes God God. And it's God's glory that's what makes God deserving of our worship. And only Him deserving of our worship. So, God does things in the world, and these plagues are like that. God does things to reveal Himself, to show us His glory. And so the things that God does in the world, like the plagues, are like a magnifying glass. And we can use the things that God does in the world to show us God's glory and to help us see Him. And that was the point of the plagues, so that the Israelites and the Egyptians would see God for who He is. Now, we usually use a magnifying glass to see things that are really small. And it's not that God's glory is really small. God's glory is way bigger than you can imagine. So it's not that God's glory is small, but we often don't see God's glory because we are sinful. Our sin stops us from seeing God's glory. It's always there. But in our sin, when we turn our backs on God, we don't see His glory. And that's why Pharaoh said no to letting God's people go. In his sin, he turned his back on God and he refused to see who God was, that He was a creator, that He was in control, and that God gets to make the decisions for all of life. And so he didn't see God's glory. He turned his back on that. And that's why Pharaoh said no, and that's sin. Well, guess what? You and I have a choice to make too. You and I are just as sinful as Pharaoh, that king of Egypt. And we have a choice. We could say no to seeing God's glory. Now that doesn't make it disappear. God's glory is still there, but we can turn our backs and ignore it. Now that's not a good thing because God has to punish that, right? God created us and He made us and He owns us and He loves us. But if we turn our backs on God, God's a good God and He will punish that. And that means that anyone who says no to God's glory, they will go to hell and they will be separated from God forever. But there's another choice we can make. We can see God's glory and we can use the magnifying glasses of all that God has done to worship God and to accept Him and to realize that He is the God of the universe who loves us. Now, we don't use our eyes like a magnifying glass. We use something else to see God's glory, and that's faith. Faith is believing in the promises of God. Faith is believing that God's work in the world is from Him and it's for our good and it shows us who He is. And this is all described for us in the Bible. That's why it's so important that we read our Bible, that we understand it, and that we believe it. Because through faith, we believe in the promises of God. In fact, it's the whole Bible that all of the Bible points to Jesus. And so when we see the Bible, when we read the Bible through faith, we will see Jesus, who has made a way for us to be forgiven of our sins. And when we're forgiven of our sins by trusting in Jesus' work on the cross, when He died, He took our punishment for us. If we trust in Jesus and believe He was raised from the dead one day, then all of us who are Christians, who believe in Jesus, we will get to be with Him forever and ever and ever, because our sins are completely gone. And one day, you won't even need a magnifying glass, and we won't even need to believe in Jesus by faith, because we will be with Him face to face, and we will get to talk with Him, we will get to see Him, we'll be right there with Him forever and ever, never to say goodbye, never to be separated from Him. So, I want to remind you that all that God does in the world, from the plagues of the Bible to all of creation, shows us God's glory. And we should see that, and we should trust God and worship Him alone because of that, by believing through Jesus that our sins are forgiven and that we can be united, we can be reunited with God and be with Him forever one day. Okay, so this is this week's challenge. Memorize a verse from Hebrews 11. So it's Hebrews 11, verse 27, and it says this, and I'm reading from the NIRV, which should be the kids' Bibles that we've given to you from Sunday school. But you can memorize it in any version that you may have. So it says this: because of his faith, Moses left Egypt. It wasn't because he was afraid of the king's anger. He didn't let anything stop him. That's because he saw the God who can't be seen.